The ancient griot had been singing the same cryptic song for 7 centuries, its verses passed down through 28 generations like a sacred flame that must never be extinguished. Nobody in the dusty villages of Mali understood why this particular song contained numbers instead of the usual tales of love, war, and harvest. They assumed it was simply another relic of the old ways, growing more meaningless with each passing year. But Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, realized on that sweltering evening in a remote village that these weren't random numbers at all. They were coordinates, precise, mathematical markers pointing to the location of 100,000 tons of gold that Mansa Musa had concealed during his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. The discovery began in the most unlikely of circumstances. Traoré had been invited to a wedding celebration by Amadou, a childhood friend from his university days in Ouagadougou. The village of Djenedjen lay 200 kilometers northeast of Timbuktu, a collection of mud brick houses and acacia trees that seemed untouched by the modern world. Traoré had almost declined the invitation. His schedule was packed with economic summits and diplomatic meetings, but something about returning to his roots called to him. The wedding festivities lasted 3 days. As was traditional, on the final evening, as the sun painted the desert horizon in shades of amber and crimson, an elderly griot named Bakari Keita took his place in the center of the celebration. His kora, a 21-stringed harp, caught the firelight as his fingers moved across the strings with practiced ease. For hours, Keita performed the familiar songs, epic tales of Sundiata Keita's rise to power, romantic ballads about star-crossed lovers separated by ancient feuds, and praise songs celebrating the harvest and the rains. The wedding guests swayed to the hypnotic rhythms, children dancing barefoot in the sand while their elders nodded in appreciation. But then something changed. Keita's weathered hands shifted to a different melody, one that seemed to emerge from a deeper, more mysterious place. His voice, still strong despite his advanced years, began to chant in ancient Mandinka, 14 and 7 and 3, 21 and 9 and 5. The Sun King's burden rests where numbers meet earth, where the river bends twice but flows once, where the baobab marks the beginning of wealth. The wedding guests fell silent, not from recognition, but from confusion. This wasn't a typical praise song or historical ballad. It sounded like someone reciting a mathematical formula set to music. Some of the younger people exchanged glances and whispered among themselves, while the elders frowned in concentration, trying to recall if they had heard these strange verses before. But Traoré, who had studied both engineering and traditional African history during his years in France, felt his pulse quicken. His academic background had taught him to recognize patterns, and something about these seemingly random numbers triggered his analytical mind. These weren't arbitrary figures. They followed a specific sequence, a mathematical logic that suggested deliberate encoding rather than poetic license. After the ceremony concluded and the other guests had dispersed to their homes or sleeping mats, Traoré approached the elderly griot. Bakari Keita was carefully wrapping his kora in a worn cloth bag, his movements slow and deliberate. "Baba," Traoré said, using the respectful term for an elder. "That final song about numbers, where did it come from?" The old man's eyes, clouded with cataracts that gave them a milky white appearance, seemed to look through time itself. He was quiet for a long moment, studying Traoré's face in the dying firelight. "My father taught me, as his father taught him," Keita finally replied, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Back to the time of the great king's journey. We were commanded to remember but never understand, to sing but never seek, to preserve but never pursue." "The great king?" Traoré pressed. "You mean Mansa Musa?" The griot nodded slowly, his expression becoming distant. "The richest man who ever lived. When he traveled to Mecca, he carried so much gold that he destroyed the economies of entire cities. But the songs say he didn't carry it all. The songs say he left the greater portion hidden, protected by riddles that only his true descendants would understand." This revelation struck Traoré like lightning. Mansa Musa's famous Hajj of 1324 was one of history's most documented journeys. Contemporary Arab chroniclers had recorded his passage through North Africa and the Middle East in astonishing detail. He had traveled with an entourage of 60,000 people, including soldiers, merchants, slaves, and holy men. The caravan had included approximately 100 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of gold dust and nuggets. The gold Mansa Musa distributed during his journey had been legendary. In Cairo, his generosity had been so excessive that the price of gold had plummeted and remained depressed for over a decade. Historians estimated that he had given away approximately 200 tons of gold during his pilgrimage, an amount that would be worth billions in today's currency. But Traoré had always been puzzled by a mathematical discrepancy that most historians seem to ignore or dismiss. The Mali Empire, at its peak under Mansa Musa's rule, had controlled the Bambouk and Bouré goldfields, which were producing an estimated 50 tons of gold annually. Mansa Musa had ruled for 25 years, and he had also inherited substantial reserves from his predecessors. Even accounting for normal expenses and tribute payments, he should have had access to at least 1,500 tons of gold. If he had only distributed 200 tons on his Hajj, where was the remaining 1,300 tons? French colonial historians had consistently dismissed this discrepancy, claiming that African oral traditions exaggerated wealth and that the empire's gold production had been overestimated. But Traoré suspected the truth was far different and far more intriguing. "Baba," he said, leaning closer to the old griot, "are there others who know songs like this?" Bakari Kada's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "There are 14 songs in total, young man. Each griot family keeps one piece of the puzzle. My family guards the third song. Only when all 14 are sung together in the proper sequence does the path reveal itself." The flight back to Ouagadougou gave Traoré time to process what he had learned. As his plane crossed the vast expanse of the Sahel, he stared down at the endless landscape of sand and scrub vegetation, wondering if somewhere beneath those shifting dunes lay the greatest treasure in human history. But this wasn't merely about gold, he realized. If Mansa Musa had indeed hidden such an enormous fortune, the political and economic implications would be staggering. Africa's current position in the global economy, as a supplier of raw materials to be processed elsewhere, could be completely transformed. The continent that had been systematically impoverished by centuries of exploitation could suddenly become the world's wealthiest region, yet the challenges were equally enormous. Any announcement of such a discovery would trigger a gold rush that could destabilize the entire continent. Every major power would want their share, from France and Britain with their colonial claims to China and the United States with their economic interests. African nations themselves might go to war over the treasure, repeating the conflicts that had weakened the continent for centuries. Traoré made a decision that would define his presidency and potentially change the course of African history. He would secretly search for the 14 griots and attempt to piece together Mansa Musa's puzzle. But he would do so carefully, using his position as head of state to create a cover story that wouldn't arouse international suspicion. Back in his presidential office in Ouagadougou, Traoré called his closest advisor, Dr. Aminata Sanogo, a brilliant economist who had helped design Burkina Faso's development strategy. "Aminata," he said, "I want to launch a cultural preservation project. We're going to document traditional songs and stories before the last master griots pass away." Dr. Sanogo raised an eyebrow. "That's admirable, Mr. President, but we have rather pressing economic issues. The drought has affected crop yields, and we still need to renegotiate our debt with the World Bank." "This is connected to our economic future," Traoré replied, though he couldn't explain how. "I want you to assemble a team of ethnomusicologists, historians, and linguists. Tell them we're creating a comprehensive archive of West African oral traditions." Over the following weeks, Traoré's cultural team began their work across the region. The cover story was perfect. UNESCO and several European foundations immediately offered funding for what they saw as an important preservation effort. None of them suspected that the president of Burkina Faso was actually assembling the greatest treasure map in human history. The search for the 14 griots required delicate diplomacy and extensive research. These weren't simply village singers. They were the hereditary keepers of state secrets, families who had maintained their silence for 7 centuries. Many had scattered across West Africa. During the various upheavals that had followed the collapse of the Mali Empire, Traoré's researchers discovered that the griots were distributed strategically across the former territories of the Mali Empire and its trading partners. 3 families remained in Mali itself, descendants of Mansa Musa's personal praise singers who had been present during the treasure's concealment. These griots lived in the ancient cities of Djenné, Gao, and Timbuktu, still maintaining their ancestral roles despite the challenges of modern life. 2 griot families had settled in Senegal, members of the Wolof kingdoms that had married into Mali royalty during the height of the empire's power. Their songs had been integrated into Wolof praise traditions, disguised as genealogical recitations. 4 families had fled to Guinea during the empire's collapse in the 16th century, following the gold miners and merchants who had supplied the Mali economy. These griots had preserved their knowledge in the highland regions, where colonial influence had been minimal. 2 families lived in Mauritania, descendants of Berber traders who had controlled the trans-Saharan routes and had been essential partners in Mali's gold trade. Their songs had been preserved in Hassaniya Arabic, creating an additional layer of linguistic protection. 1 family resided in Niger, among the Tuareg peoples who had served as guides and protectors for Mansa Musa's Hajj caravan. Their song had been integrated into Tuareg poetry, disguised as a tale of desert navigation. Another family had settled in Ivory Coast among the Akan peoples, who had been renowned gold miners and had supplied much of the empire's wealth. Their song had been preserved as part of mining traditions and metallurgical knowledge. The remaining 2 families lived in Burkina Faso itself, descendants of the Mossi warriors who had guarded the empire's southern frontiers and had likely been responsible for protecting the treasure site. Finding these families required months of patient investigation. Many had been approached by researchers before: French colonial administrators, British anthropologists, American ethnomusicologists, all of whom had sensed that the griots possessed valuable information but had never understood the full scope of what was being hidden. The breakthrough came when Traoré met Aminata Diabaté, a 95-year-old griot living in a small village outside Bamako, Mali. She was the keeper of the first song, the one that began the entire sequence. When Traoré arrived at her compound, accompanied by his cultural team, she studied him carefully, with eyes that seemed to see through decades of history. "I have been waiting for you," she said simply. "Not you personally, but someone like you. Someone with power, but also knowledge, authority, but also respect. The ancestors told us that such a person would come when Africa was ready to be truly free." Over the course of 3 days, Aminata taught Traoré the first song. As he learned the verses, the sophisticated nature of Mansa Musa's encoding became clear. Each song contained 3 distinct elements: mathematical coordinates disguised as praise numbers and genealogical references, geographical landmarks described in poetic metaphors that would remain recognizable across centuries, protective warnings embedded in the melody and rhythm, designed to prevent unauthorized access. The first song established the basic framework. Its opening verses, when decoded, provided the primary coordinates for the treasure's location. But the song also contained warnings about the dangers of seeking the gold without proper preparation, and the spiritual authorization of all 14 griot families. This treasure was not hidden from foreign enemies, Aminata explained to Traoré. In 1324, no European or Asian power could have found it even with their primitive technology. Mansa Musa hid it from us, from African kingdoms that would have fought over it, destroying each other for temporary wealth. He knew that such riches would only benefit Africa when Africa could speak with one voice. The process of finding and convincing the remaining 13 griots took 8 more months. Each family required different approaches and different forms of persuasion. Some needed proof of Traoré's legitimate authority, demonstrations of his knowledge of African history and traditions. Others required participation in sacred ceremonies to verify his spiritual worthiness. A few demanded guarantees that their ancestral knowledge would be used for the benefit of all African peoples, not just for personal enrichment. The most challenging negotiation was with Mahmoud Ag Attaher, a Tuareg griot living in the Air Mountains of Niger. His family had been the guides for Mansa Musa's Hajj caravan, and they maintained that their song was the most crucial piece of the puzzle, the one that revealed the specific route to the treasure site. Mahmoud tested Traoré's knowledge of Islamic scholarship, desert survival, and Tuareg history for 3 weeks before agreeing to share his family's song. The test included navigating 200 kilometers of desert using traditional methods, reciting portions of the Quran in classical Arabic, and demonstrating understanding of the astronomical calculations that medieval Muslim travelers had used for navigation. When Mahmoud finally performed his family's song, it became clear why his griot lineage had considered themselves so essential. Their verses contained precise astronomical references that would allow someone to calculate the exact position of various stars and planets, as they had appeared in the year 1324. This information would be crucial for interpreting the geographical clues in the other songs. Dr. Sarah Konaté, a brilliant linguist from the University of Dakar who had joined Traoré's cultural team, made a crucial discovery while analyzing the songs. She realized that they weren't written in a single language, but rather in a complex mixture of medieval Mandinka, classical Arabic, Tamashek, the Tuareg language, and even traces of ancient Egyptian and Hebrew. This linguistic complexity wasn't accidental, she explained to Traoré. Mansa Musa deliberately used multiple languages to create additional layers of protection. Anyone attempting to decode the songs would need to be fluent in all these languages and understand their medieval forms. It was like creating a linguistic encryption system 700 years before modern cryptography. The geographical references in the songs were equally sophisticated. Rather than simple descriptions of landmarks, they used poetic metaphors that would remain meaningful even if the landscape changed over time. Rivers might shift their courses, forests could become deserts, and human settlements could disappear, but certain fundamental geographical features would endure. One song referred to where the river bends twice but flows once. Research revealed that this described a specific type of geological formation, where an ancient riverbed had carved 2 curves in the bedrock. But the modern river followed a more direct path, creating a distinctive pattern visible from elevated positions. Another song mentioned the baobab that grows where baobabs cannot grow. This seemed impossible until Dr. Boubacar Diallo, a botanist from the University of Ouagadougou, explained that it likely referred to a baobab tree that had been deliberately transplanted to an elevation or climate where such trees couldn't naturally survive. Such a tree would have been an unmistakable marker, visible for centuries. The most complex geographical reference was where the Earth remembers the ancient sea. Geological surveys eventually revealed that this pointed to a specific region in the Ahagar Mountains, where marine fossils could be found at high altitude, evidence of ancient sea floor that had been uplifted during the formation of the Sahara. As the 14 songs came together, they revealed a treasure map of unprecedented sophistication. The coordinates, when properly calculated, pointed to a remote location in the Ahagar Mountains on the border between Algeria and Mali. But reaching those coordinates would require navigating a series of specific landmarks while avoiding numerous false paths and dangerous terrain. More importantly, the songs made it clear that finding the treasure was only the first challenge. The gold had been protected by what Mansa Musa called the 3 deaths, elaborate traps designed to kill anyone who approached the treasure with greed rather than wisdom. The first death was described as the mountain's hunger, apparently a rockfall trap, triggered by disturbing the entrance to the treasure chamber. The second death was the breath that sleeps, likely some form of toxic gas that would be released when the chamber was opened. The third death was the gold that devours, a psychological trap that would somehow prevent intruders from leaving the treasure chamber alive. By December 2025, Traoré had assembled all 14 songs and begun planning an expedition to locate the treasure. However, he was no longer the only person interested in Mansa Musa's gold. French intelligence services had been monitoring Traoré's cultural preservation project from the beginning. The Direction Générale de la Sécurité Extérieure, DGSE, had maintained files on African griot traditions since the colonial period, suspecting that oral histories contained information valuable to French interests. When their surveillance detected that Traoré was meeting with griots from multiple countries and regions, French agents began their own investigation. They had intercepted some of the songs through electronic surveillance, but lacked the linguistic and cultural expertise to decode them properly. The Vatican also became involved when Father Miguel Santos, a Portuguese priest working in Mali, reported unusual activity among griots in his region. The Catholic Church had maintained records of early Portuguese expeditions to West Africa, including references to legends about Mansa Musa's hidden treasure. Cardinal Alessandro Bertoli, the Vatican's Secretary of State, authorized a discreet investigation. Meanwhile, Chinese commercial satellites had been conducting systematic scans of the Sahara, ostensibly searching for mineral deposits for potential mining ventures. But artificial intelligence analysis of the satellite imagery was actually looking for geographical anomalies that might indicate buried treasure. The Chinese had narrowed their search to a 1,000 square kilometer area that included the actual location of Mansa Musa's treasure. Traoré realized that he was racing against time. International interest in his activities was growing, and he needed to mount an expedition before other parties could interfere. But organizing such an expedition presented enormous challenges. The treasure's location lay in disputed territory on the Algeria-Mali border, a region controlled by various Tuareg rebel groups and occasionally patrolled by Algerian military forces. Any official expedition would require diplomatic clearances that would expose the mission's true purpose. Furthermore, the team would need to cross some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Summer temperatures in the Ahagar Mountains could exceed 50 degrees Celsius during the day, while dropping below freezing at night. Sandstorms could reduce visibility to mere meters and last for days. There were no roads, no permanent water sources, and no communication infrastructure. Traoré solved these problems by assembling a team that could disappear into the desert without attracting attention. Dr. Amadou Diop was a Malian geologist who had spent decades mapping the Sahara for international mining companies. He knew the terrain better than anyone and had the scientific equipment needed to locate and safely enter underground chambers. Captain Fatima Aguessa was a Tuareg guide whose family had controlled desert routes for centuries. She could navigate by the stars, find water in apparently barren landscapes, and communicate with the various armed groups that operated in the region. Professor Chen Wei was a Chinese archaeologist who had grown disillusioned with his government's treasure hunting activities. He had defected during a conference in France, bringing with him detailed knowledge of Chinese satellite surveillance and artificial intelligence analysis. Maria Santos was a Portuguese historian who worked at the Vatican's secret archives. She had accessed classified documents about early Portuguese expeditions to Africa and had stolen copies of maps and reports that corroborated the griot songs. Kwame Asante was a Ghanaian engineer who specialized in ancient African construction techniques. His expertise would be crucial for understanding how Mansa Musa's engineers had built the treasure chamber and its protective systems. The team gathered in Gao, Mali, in January 2026, posing as a documentary crew filming a series about trans-Saharan trade routes. Their cover story was comprehensive. They had legitimate filming permits, professional camera equipment, and a credible production company backing them. But hidden within their documentary equipment were ground-penetrating radar systems, excavation tools, breathing apparatus for exploring underground chambers, and weapons for protection against both human and environmental threats. The journey to the coordinates required 7 days of travel through increasingly difficult terrain. They used modified Toyota Land Cruisers for the first 3 days, following ancient caravan routes that were still marked by stone cairns and scattered pottery shards. As they moved deeper into the Hoard Mountains, the landscape became increasingly surreal. Volcanic plugs rose like ancient towers from the desert floor. Wind-carved rocks created natural sculptures that seemed to shift and change as the light moved across them. The silence was so complete that it felt oppressive, broken only by the sound of their vehicles and the occasional distant call of a desert bird. On the fourth day, they abandoned their vehicles and continued on foot with pack camels provided by Captain Fatima's Tuareg contacts. The camels were essential. They could carry heavy equipment across terrain that would be impossible for vehicles while requiring minimal water. The most challenging part of the journey was navigating by the griot songs rather than modern GPS systems. The songs had warned that compasses lie where the metal sleeps, apparently a reference to magnetic anomalies in the area that would interfere with electronic navigation equipment. Instead, they had to use the astronomical references in the songs, calculating the positions of specific stars and planets as they had appeared in the medieval period and adjusting for the precession of the Earth's axis over the intervening centuries. On the eighth day, they found the first marker described in the songs, a baobab tree growing at an elevation where such trees shouldn't be able to survive. The massive tree, easily over 500 years old, stood alone on a rocky plateau, its distinctive bottle-shaped trunk unmistakable even from a distance. Around the base of the baobab, they found stones arranged in a pattern that matched the rhythmic structure of the third griot song. This was confirmation that they were on the right track. But the songs made it clear that the actual treasure was still some distance away. According to the decoded instructions, they needed to travel exactly 700 steps toward the position where the star Sirius would have risen during the summer solstice. In the year 1324, this calculation required Professor Chen's knowledge of historical astronomy and precise mathematical computations, the 700. Steps led them to a cliff face that appeared completely natural. The rock formation was typical of the Hoard Mountains, layers of volcanic stone weathered by millennia of wind and temperature extremes. But Kwame Asante noticed subtle anomalies that suggested human modification. The entire cliff face was slightly concave, as if it had been carved and then disguised to look natural. More tellingly, there were almost imperceptible tool marks on some of the stones, weathered but still visible to someone who knew what to look for. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed what the songs had promised. Behind the rock face was a massive void, a cavern at least 200 meters deep and 100 meters wide. But the entrance was sealed with precisely fitted stones that had been cemented together with some form of ancient mortar. The first death trap activated the moment they began removing stones from the sealed entrance. As Dr. Diop pried loose the first stone with a crowbar, a cascade of rocks began falling from above, not randomly, but in a carefully calculated pattern designed to crush anyone standing in front of the entrance. Only Captain Fatima's desert-honed instincts saved them. She had been listening to the subtle sounds of the rock face and heard the preliminary creaking that indicated structural instability. Her shout of warning came just seconds before the rockfall began, giving the team time to scramble to safety. The trap was ingeniously designed. Removing stones in the wrong sequence would trigger a chain reaction that would bring down the entire entrance, permanently sealing the treasure chamber while killing anyone nearby. But the seventh griot song had contained the solution, a specific sequence of stone removal based on the ritual movements of Islamic prayer. It took 3 days of careful work to open the entrance safely. Each stone had to be removed according to the pattern described in the song, with specific pauses between each removal to allow the structure to stabilize. The ancient engineers had created a lock that could only be opened by someone who understood both the mechanical principles involved and the religious significance of the unlocking sequence. The second death trap awaited them inside the entrance tunnel. Maria Santos's portable air quality sensor detected hydrogen sulfide gas at concentrations that would be lethal within minutes. The gas was heavier than air and had accumulated in the lower levels of the cavern over centuries. The songs had warned about the breath of death that sleeps until awakened. Any disturbance of the air in the cavern would mix the poisonous gas with breathable atmosphere, creating a deadly environment throughout the chamber. But the griot songs had also provided the solution. Fire purifies the path that wisdom opens. By using controlled burns, they could oxidize the hydrogen sulfide gas, converting it into sulfur dioxide, which could then be ventilated out of the cavern using fans powered by portable generators. The process took 2 days and required careful monitoring to ensure they didn't create new hazards. But eventually, the air in the entrance tunnel became safe for human breathing, though they still wore protective masks as a precaution. The third death trap nearly succeeded despite their preparations. As they descended into the main cavern with powerful LED lights, they were immediately confronted by piles of gold scattered near the entrance. Coins, jewelry, artifacts, and raw nuggets that glittered hypnotically in the artificial light. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Professor Chen rushed forward with a cry of excitement, and Maria Santos began filling her backpack with coins. Even Dr. Diop, the most scientifically minded member of the team, seemed transfixed by the immediate sight of wealth beyond imagination. But Traoré remembered the warning from the songs. "The first gold is the last gold for the foolish," managed to stop his team just before. They stepped onto what appeared to be a solid floor covered with treasure. Careful examination revealed that the gold near the entrance was bait, strategically placed on a false floor. Beneath the thin layer of stones and sand was a pit filled with metal spikes, still sharp after 7 centuries. The trap was designed to kill treasure hunters who were overcome by greed and rushed forward without careful observation. The real treasure lay deeper in the cavern, past this final test of wisdom versus avarice. When they finally reached the main treasure chamber, what they discovered defied every expectation and historical precedent. The cavern was enormous, roughly the size of a football stadium, and filled with gold organized with mathematical precision that spoke to the sophisticated administrative systems of the Mali Empire. The treasure wasn't simply dumped or stacked randomly. It had been arranged in specific patterns that told the complete story of the Mali Empire's wealth and power. Gold coins were sorted by year of minting and ruler, creating a chronological record of the empire's monetary system that historians had never seen. Jewelry was grouped by cultural origin: Mandinka, Berber, Arab, and even Chinese and Indian pieces acquired through trans-Saharan and oceanic trade routes. Raw gold was formed into standardized blocks, each weighing exactly 10 pounds according to the Islamic measurement system used by medieval Mali. But the gold, staggering as it was, represented only part of the treasure. The walls of the cavern were lined with manuscripts, thousands of leather-bound books and scrolls that had been preserved by the dry desert air. These weren't just religious texts, though there were many Quran copies and Islamic commentaries. The collection included scientific treatises on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering, historical chronicles of the Mali Empire and its neighbors, geographical descriptions of trade routes and distant lands, philosophical works that demonstrated the intellectual sophistication of medieval African thinkers, technical manuals for mining, metallurgy, and construction. Maria Santos, with her experience in manuscript preservation, immediately recognized the historical significance. "This is the lost library of Timbuktu," she whispered. "The manuscripts that disappeared when the city was conquered, they weren't destroyed. They were hidden here for protection." In the center of the chamber stood what made everyone stop and stare: a scale model of the Mali Empire constructed entirely from gold. The three-dimensional map showed every major city, every trade route, every gold mine, and every tributary kingdom. It was a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship that contained geographical and political information historians had thought lost forever. Dr. Diop's instruments confirmed what seemed impossible. The gold was 99.9% pure, refined using techniques that European metallurgists wouldn't develop for another 400 years. The total quantity was staggering. His calculations suggested more than 100,000 tons of gold. More than all the gold reserves of the modern United States, Germany, and France combined. But as they explored the chamber, They noticed something deeply troubling: fresh footprints in the dust, made within the last few weeks. Someone else had been here recently, and they had taken items from the collection. There were obvious gaps in the manuscript collection where books had been removed. Empty spaces in the gold arrangements showed where significant quantities had been extracted. Most ominously, they found a note written in French: "We have taken our share. Consider this interest on colonial debts. Do not attempt retrieval. Direction Générale de la Sécurité Extérieure." The French intelligence service had found the treasure first, probably using their own analysis of intercepted griot songs combined with satellite surveillance. They had taken an estimated 5,000 tons of gold and hundreds of the most valuable manuscripts. Traoré faced an impossible decision as he stood in Mansa Musa's treasure chamber. If he announced the discovery, it would trigger a global gold rush that could destabilize not just Africa, but the entire world economy. The location was in disputed territory that Algeria, Mali, and even Morocco could claim based on historical arguments. France would certainly assert colonial rights to the treasure. China would invoke their mining investments in the region. The United States might intervene on the grounds of preventing international conflict. African nations themselves could go to war over shares of the wealth, but keeping the discovery. Secret meant allowing France to profit from their theft, while denying Africa the resources that could transform the continent's future. The solution came from Mansa Musa himself. Among the manuscripts, Traoré found the emperor's personal journal, written in his own hand during the final years of his reign. In elegant Arabic script, Mansa Musa had explained his vision. "This gold is not for one kingdom or one generation, but for all of Africa when Africa is ready to unite. I have hidden it not from foreign enemies, they lack the knowledge to find it, but from African rulers who would fight over it, destroying each other for temporary wealth. When Africa speaks with one voice, the gold will speak for Africa." Traoré made the most consequential decision of his life. He would announce the discovery to prove it existed, but he wouldn't reveal the location until African nations signed a binding agreement to share the treasure equally. The announcement, made at the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa in February 2026, changed the course of world history. Traoré stood before 54 African heads of state with a simple wooden box containing a single gold bar and photographs of the treasure chamber. "This gold," he declared as the room erupted in chaos, "belongs to every African child born and unborn. Not to governments, not to presidents, not to nations, but to the people. I propose the Mansa Musa Compact. All signing nations receive equal shares, but only if they commit to using the wealth for education, health care, and infrastructure. No weapons, no palaces, no Swiss bank accounts." The debate was ferocious. Nigeria demanded proportional shares based on population. South Africa wanted allocations based on economic contribution. Egypt claimed historical precedence as the heir to ancient African civilizations. But Traoré held the ultimate leverage. Only he knew the location. The 14 griots, now under government protection, had sworn to maintain their secrecy. His expedition team members were loyal to the vision of African unity. Without cooperation, the gold would remain hidden. International reactions were swift and intense. France immediately claimed the treasure based on colonial treaties and demanded access to the site. When Traoré revealed evidence of their theft, samples of stolen gold and photographs of French agents in the treasure chamber, it became an international scandal that toppled the French government. China offered a different approach, proposing massive infrastructure investments in exchange for gold access. Traoré's response became famous. "You can build infrastructure for fair payment, not for ownership. Africa will hire you, not sell itself to you." The Vatican took a surprising position. Pope Francis personally traveled to Ouagadougou to apologize for centuries of Catholic complicity in colonialism and offer church resources to help distribute the gold fairly. The most dramatic moment came when Russia attempted military intimidation, moving naval forces toward the African coast. Traoré's response was broadcast live around the world. "Russia can threaten, but they cannot dig." The gold stays buried until Africa unites. The Mansa Musa Compact was signed on May 25, 2026, Africa Day, in a ceremony that symbolized the continent's transformation from victim to victor in the global economy. All 54 African Union member states signed the agreement, accepting equal shares regardless of size, population, or current wealth. The terms were revolutionary: 50% of each nation's gold allocation for education and health care, 30% for infrastructure. Development 20% for climate adaptation and environmental protection, 0% for military spending or luxury projects. Citizen oversight committees, not governments, would monitor spending. Gold extraction limited to 1,000 tons annually to prevent market disruption. At current gold prices, each nation would receive approximately $1 billion annually for the next century. But more importantly, Africa would control the world's largest gold reserve, providing backing for a new African currency immune to manipulation by foreign central banks. The extraction operation became a showcase of African expertise. Instead of hiring Western mining companies, the African Union created a continental consortium drawing talent from across the continent. South African deep mining engineers, Ghanaian gold processing specialists, Nigerian logistics experts, and Egyptian archaeological conservators. Every position, from security personnel to financial auditors, was filled by African professionals. The operation became the largest skills transfer program in African history, with experts from mineral-rich nations training colleagues from countries with less mining experience. The site itself was transformed into something unprecedented, a working archaeological preserve. The treasure chamber was carefully mapped and photographed before any gold was removed. Replicas replaced extracted items so that the chamber's historical integrity remained intact. The site became a pilgrimage destination where Africans could witness their reclaimed heritage. The Manuscript Preservation Project revolutionized understanding of medieval African civilization. Dr. Amina Kone, a Senegalese conservation specialist, led the effort to digitize every document before removal. What emerged was the most complete library of medieval African knowledge ever assembled. Mathematical treatises demonstrated that African scholars had independently developed calculus, advanced algebra, and complex astronomical calculations centuries before similar European discoveries. Medical texts described surgical procedures and pharmaceutical preparations that modern doctors confirmed as remarkably effective. Engineering manuals contained architectural principles for earthquake-resistant construction using locally available materials. One manuscript fundamentally changed the understanding of global history. Written by a Malian scholar who had traveled with Chinese trading expeditions, it described African navigators reaching the Americas decades before Columbus. The document included detailed maps of the Caribbean islands and descriptions of contact with indigenous peoples. The global economic impact of Africa's sudden wealth was immediate and profound. Gold prices initially spiked due to supply concerns, then stabilized as African nations demonstrated disciplined, controlled release of their reserves. The steady flow of 1,000 tons annually actually stabilized global gold markets while generating enormous revenue for African development. More significantly, the dollar began losing its dominance as the world's primary reserve currency. The new African Continental Currency, ACC, backed by the world's largest gold reserves, became an attractive alternative for international trade. Nations weary of American economic hegemony began conducting business in ACCs, creating a multipolar financial system. Western nations faced a choice that would define the 21st century: adapt to the new reality of African wealth and independence, or become increasingly irrelevant in a rebalanced global economy. Most chose adaptation, but not without struggle. France experienced the most dramatic adjustment. The theft scandal had triggered mass protests and the fall of President Macron's government. The new French leadership, desperate to restore international credibility, agreed to return all stolen manuscripts and pay substantial compensation for the gold they had taken. French companies that had operated in Africa under exploitative colonial-era agreements found their contracts terminated. African nations, now financially independent, demanded fair partnerships or ended business relationships entirely. The CFA, France's tool for monetary control over former colonies, was abandoned as African nations adopted the ACC. Britain attempted to maintain influence through the Commonwealth, but African members began withdrawing when it became clear that their new wealth made British economic partnerships unnecessary. Nigeria's departure from the Commonwealth in 2027 triggered an exodus that left the organization representing mainly small island nations. The United States initially tried to maintain its African relationships through military partnerships and aid programs, but African nations no longer needed American aid, and their new wealth allowed them to purchase advanced military equipment from multiple suppliers, reducing dependence on American weapons systems. China's approach proved more adaptable, recognizing that their Belt and Road Initiative could no longer rely on debt diplomacy. Chinese companies offered genuine technology partnerships. Africa became a major investor in Chinese infrastructure projects rather than a recipient of Chinese loans. The transformation of individual African nations was remarkable. Ghana, using its gold allocation, eliminated malaria within 3 years through a comprehensive program combining traditional medicinal knowledge with modern vector control. The country's education system, now fully funded, began producing graduates who competed successfully with those from elite Western universities. Kenya used its wealth to become a technological powerhouse, investing heavily in renewable energy and digital infrastructure. The country's universities, equipped with unlimited research funding, made breakthroughs in solar technology and agricultural innovation that were exported globally. Rwanda's approach focused on creating a model society that other nations could emulate. The country achieved 100% literacy, eliminated extreme poverty, and developed one of the world's most sophisticated healthcare systems by combining traditional healing practices with modern medicine. 5 years after the discovery, Africa was culturally and intellectually ascendant in ways that surpassed even its economic transformation. The manuscripts from Mansa Musa's treasure had provided historical validation for African achievement that countered centuries of colonial propaganda about African inferiority. African universities, now adequately funded, began attracting the world's best scholars. The University of Timbuktu was rebuilt based on architectural plans found in the manuscripts, becoming a 150,000-student campus that rivaled Harvard and Cambridge. The new University of Great Zimbabwe was constructed using ancient engineering techniques that made it earthquake-resistant without modern materials. The Mansa Musa Institute of Advanced Studies, built at the treasure site, became the world's leading center for African historical research. Scholars from every continent came to study the manuscripts and artifacts, fundamentally revising understanding of medieval global civilization. African languages experienced a renaissance as well, with economic necessity no longer forcing Africans to prioritize European languages. Traditional languages were revitalized and modernized. Technical and scientific vocabularies were developed in Yoruba, Swahili, Amharic, and dozens of other languages. The cultural impact was equally profound. African music, always globally influential, became dominant as African artists gained access to unlimited resources for production and promotion. African fashion set international trends as designers drew inspiration from historical manuscripts that revealed centuries of sophisticated textile and clothing traditions. African cinema emerged as a major global force when directors gained access to Hollywood-level budgets. Films exploring African history, culture, and contemporary life found international audiences hungry for perspectives beyond Western narratives. The African space program, jointly funded by all member nations, achieved remarkable success. The African Space Consortium launched its first satellites in 2028, providing continent-wide internet coverage and Earth observation capabilities independent of Western providers. Plans for lunar mining operations, backed by African gold reserves, positioned the continent as a leader in space technology. Not everyone accepted Africa's transformation peacefully. Several attempts were made to destabilize the continent and regain Western control over its resources. The most serious challenge came from extremist groups funded by shadowy Western interests. These organizations attempted to foment religious and ethnic conflicts that would justify international intervention. Terrorist attacks in major African cities were designed to create chaos that would require Western peacekeeping forces. But African unity, strengthened by shared prosperity, proved resilient. The African Union's new Continental Security Force, equipped with advanced technology purchased with gold revenues, effectively countered these threats. Intelligence sharing between African nations reached unprecedented levels, making it difficult for external actors to exploit internal divisions. The economic warfare was more subtle but equally dangerous. Western financial institutions attempted to manipulate currency markets to destabilize the ACC. Coordinated media campaigns sought to portray African governments as corrupt and incompetent. Despite transparent oversight systems that actually exceeded Western standards for accountability, these attacks ultimately backfired. Each attempt to undermine African success only strengthened continental unity and resolve. The shared experience of facing external threats created a Pan-African identity that transcended traditional ethnic and national boundaries. The climate crisis became an unexpected avenue for African leadership. The continent's new wealth allowed massive investments in renewable energy and environmental restoration. The Great Green Wall project, stretching across the Sahel, was completed in record time using traditional ecological knowledge combined with modern technology. African innovations in solar energy, developed at well-funded universities, began revolutionizing global renewable energy markets. The continent that had been most vulnerable to climate change became a leader in developing solutions that could benefit the entire world. By 2030, the geopolitical landscape had fundamentally shifted. Africa was no longer a peripheral supplier of raw materials, but a central pillar of the global economy. The African Continental Free Trade Area, backed by unlimited financial resources, became the world's largest economic zone. African companies began acquiring struggling Western corporations. African banks provided development loans to American cities facing infrastructure crises. African technology firms outcompeted Silicon Valley in artificial intelligence and quantum computing research. The reversal was complete and historically unprecedented. For the first time since the medieval period, Africa was not just economically independent, but economically dominant. The philosophical impact was equally profound. Ubuntu, the African principle that I am because we are, began influencing global economic thinking. The concept of wealth as communal rather than individual challenged Western capitalism's focus on individual accumulation. African models of environmental stewardship, drawn from traditional ecological knowledge preserved in the manuscripts, offered alternatives to the extractive economic models that had created the climate crisis. The African approach to technology development, emphasizing social benefit over profit maximization, influenced global technology policy. African research institutions, freed from pressure to commercialize every discovery, made breakthrough scientific advances that they shared freely with the global community. The 14 griot families who had preserved Mansa Musa's secret for 7 centuries became continental heroes. Each family received a golden staff inscribed with their ancestral song and was awarded a place of honor in African society. Their children became the first students at the Mansa Musa University, where traditional knowledge systems were integrated with modern education. The university's curriculum required all students to learn one of the 14 songs, ensuring that this crucial piece of African heritage would never again be at risk of disappearing. The griots themselves became professors and researchers, working with scholars to decode other oral traditions that might contain lost historical knowledge. Their methods of preserving information across centuries became subjects of academic study, offering insights into memory, culture, and historical transmission. Old Bakari Keita, The griot, whose wedding performance had started the entire adventure, lived to see Africa's transformation. At 89 years old, he performed the complete 14 songs at the African Union's annual celebration of Africa Day. His voice, still strong and clear, carried across the assembled delegates as he concluded, "We kept the secret for 700 years so that you could share the wealth for 700 more. Remember the songs. Remember the wisdom. Remember that gold is a servant, not a master." The baobab tree that had marked the treasure site became a symbol of African resilience. Protected within a climate-controlled preserve, the ancient tree continued to thrive as millions of visitors came to pay their respects to the wisdom of their ancestors. Scientists discovered that the tree was over 1,000 years old, deliberately transplanted by Mansa Musa's engineers as a living marker that would outlast stone monuments or metal plaques. Its continued survival became a metaphor for African culture, rooted deeply, resilient to harsh conditions, and bearing fruit that nourished future generations. The final revelation came from Mansa Musa's personal testament, the last manuscript he had written before his death in 1337. Found in a sealed section of the treasure chamber, it contained a prophecy that proved remarkably accurate. When the songs unite and the gold emerges, Africa will teach the world that wealth is not what you have, but what you share. The treasure I hid will buy not things, but thoughts. Not power, but possibilities. Not dominance, but dignity. The true treasure was never the gold, it was the unity required to find it. His words proved prophetic. The process of finding and sharing the treasure had created unprecedented African unity. Nations that had been divided by colonial borders, ethnic differences, and economic competition had learned to work together for their common benefit. The treasure had forced African leaders to think beyond narrow national interests. The requirement for consensus had created new traditions of consultation and cooperation that strengthened democratic institutions across the continent. The youth of Africa, educated in schools built with gold and inspired by stories of their heritage, grew up with a fundamentally different understanding of their place in the world. They were not the recipients of charity or victims of history, but inheritors of the world's greatest civilization and contributors to its future development. Today, children across Africa sing the 14 songs as part of their regular education. Each school day begins with students reciting the mathematical coordinates, geographical landmarks, and cultural wisdom that their ancestors had preserved through centuries of hardship. But the songs have evolved beyond their original purpose. Teachers use them to teach mathematics through rhythm and melody. Geographers use them to explain landscape formation and climate patterns. Historians use them to demonstrate the sophistication of medieval African knowledge systems. The treasure chamber itself has become Africa's most sacred space. The empty vaults, their gold redistributed for the benefit of African children, serve as meditation halls where leaders come to reflect on the responsibilities of power. The walls display reproductions of the manuscripts that revolutionized understanding of African achievement. The golden model of the Mali Empire has become a planning tool for continental development, helping leaders visualize connections and opportunities across the vast African landscape. Every African child learns the story of Ibrahim Traoré, the president who could have claimed the treasure for personal wealth, but instead chose to share it with an entire continent. His example established new standards for African leadership, emphasizing service over enrichment and unity over division. The French gold that had been stolen was eventually returned through international pressure and legal action. The thieves who had taken 5,000 tons became criminals in the eyes of history, while the leaders who had shared 95,000 tons became heroes. The story's lesson resonated far beyond Africa. Indigenous peoples in the Americas, Asia, and Australia began demanding similar arrangements for their natural resources. The principle was established that wealth belonged to people, not just to those with power. Mansa Musa's ultimate wisdom was revealed. He had not hidden gold from enemies, but had saved it from his own people until they were ready to use it wisely. By requiring unity to access the treasure, he had forced Africans to become worthy of their inheritance. The prophecy's fulfillment was evident in every African city, where children played in parks built with gold, studied in schools funded by treasure, and received health care that combined ancient wisdom with modern medicine. The continent that had been systematically impoverished for centuries had reclaimed its birthright as the wealthy heart of human civilization. The songs that had once been secret were now sung openly, their message transformed from hidden code to public celebration. Each performance ended the same way, with voices rising in harmony. The Sun King's burden has lifted. The numbers have become words. The river flows freely. The baobab bears fruit. And Africa's children are golden. The treasure had served its ultimate purpose. It had not just made Africa wealthy, it had made Africa whole.